The Buick Bug looked like a bullet on wheels from a time when automobiles were only beginning to prove to the world that they could be something more than slow horse-drawn carriages without horses. In an era when most automobiles had tall bodies, room for 2 passengers, exposed mechanical components, and speeds that today would not impress even a scooter, Buick created a machine that was low, narrow, streamlined, and brutally focused on a single goal: to go as fast as possible. The Buick Bug, also known as the Buick 60 Special, was one of the most remarkable American racing cars of the early 20th century. It had a huge 4-cylinder engine with a displacement of more than 10 liters, an aluminum body, a centrally positioned driver's seat, and performance figures that sounded almost unreal at the time. It could exceed 100 miles per hour, which is more than 160 kilometers per hour, and some sources even mention speeds approaching 180 kilometers per hour. It should be remembered that only a few years earlier, similar figures belonged to absolute land speed records. The Buick Bug was therefore not merely a strange curiosity. It was a preview of a new era of racing in America, the era of Indianapolis, enormous engines, fearless drivers, and cars built to ignite the imagination of the public. It was small on the outside, but in terms of significance it proved to be a giant. The story of the Buick Bug begins at a time when Buick was one of the most important brands in the young American automobile industry. Today, many people associate Buick with large, comfortable cars for relaxed drivers, but at the beginning of the 20th century, the brand had a completely different character. Buick wanted to be seen as modern, fast, and daring. William C. Durant played a huge role in this transformation, as he was a man who perfectly understood the value of motorsport as advertising. Before the phrase "win on Sunday, sell on Monday" became an obvious principle in American motoring, Durant already understood its meaning. Successes on the racetrack were meant to convince customers that Buick automobiles were powerful, durable, and superior to the competition. In 1907, Buick created one of the most significant racing programs in the United States. The budget was enormous for the era, and the team recruited the best drivers available. Among them were Louis Chevrolet and Bob Berman, men who not only drove fast, but also helped create the legend of American motorsport. The Bug was born in precisely this atmosphere, a climate of competition, ambition, and the belief that technical madness could be the best advertisement for a brand. One of the reasons for the creation of the Buick Bug was the events that took place at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Today, Indianapolis is associated primarily with the legendary 500-mile race that was first held in 1911. However, before the birth of the Indianapolis 500, the track hosted many different competitions and speed trials. Buick wanted to establish its presence there. According to descriptions from the era, after Buick cars were disqualified during one of the events at Indianapolis, the company's management decided to return with something radical. The answer was 2 extraordinary racing cars built in a very short period of time. These machines became known as the Buick 60 Special, but the public quickly gave them a more descriptive name: Bug. The name was somewhat humorous, but it suited the car's appearance. The automobile had a narrow, streamlined body, resembling an insect or a projectile, and on the front it carried a painted ram's head intended to symbolize Buick's aggressive return to competition. It was a vehicle designed not only to be fast, but also to look unlike anything else on the track. In those days, image was enormously important. The public had to remember a car, and the Bug was impossible to forget. The most distinctive feature of the Buick Bug was its bodywork. In an era when most racing cars still had fairly traditional proportions and room for both a driver and a mechanic, the Bug looked like an experiment from the future. It was narrow, low, and single-seated. The driver sat in the center, which was an extraordinarily unusual solution. Earlier racing cars often carried a mechanic whose task was to monitor engine operation, fuel pressure, lubrication, and possible failures during the race. The Buick 60 Special abandoned this arrangement. It was a car designed solely for the driver, resembling later single-seat racing machines far more than the typical race cars of the early century. The streamlined aluminum body featured a rounded nose, while the traditional flat radiator was replaced by cooling tubes routed around the bodywork. Today this may seem unusual, but at the time, it reflected an attempt to reduce air resistance. The wheels received aluminum covers that were also intended to improve airflow. Interestingly, according to some accounts, the shape of the vehicle was designed partly for visual effect, and only later were its aerodynamic advantages recognized. Regardless of the original intentions, the Bug was one of the most futuristic-looking American racing cars of its era. At the heart of the Buick Bug was a gigantic four-cylinder engine with a displacement of approximately 622 cubic inches, or about 10.2 liters. Each cylinder had a displacement greater than the entire engine of many modern city cars. It was an overhead valve design, which was extremely important to Buick's image. David Dunbar Buick had earlier developed the idea of an engine with valves in the cylinder head, a solution known today as the overhead valve engine. At a time when side valve engines were extremely common, Buick eagerly emphasized the advantages of its system. The racing Bug therefore became not only a racing machine, but also a moving advertisement for the technology used by the company. Engine output was approximately 57 to 60 horsepower. Today, such a figure from more than 10 liters of displacement seems absurdly low. But in that era, something else mattered. Enormous torque, simplicity, durability, and the ability to operate at low engine speeds. The engine had massive pistons that were compared to cans or coffee containers, and its sound and the flames emerging from its open exhausts made a tremendous impression on spectators. The Bug was a car that not only went fast, but also sounded and looked like a mechanical monster. Power was transmitted to the rear axle through a manual 3-speed gearbox. The drivetrain was simple, strong, and entirely devoted to speed. The car weighed approximately 2,600 pounds, or just under 1,200 kilograms. Considering the enormous engine, this was a relatively low weight, especially for the beginning of the 20th century. Thanks to this, the Buick Bug could achieve speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. During time trials at Indianapolis, figures of more than 105 miles per hour were recorded, corresponding to over 169 kilometers per hour. Some sources state that the car could reach approximately 180 kilometers per hour. These were absolutely extreme speeds for an era in which roads were often rough, tires were still in their infancy, and safety systems practically did not exist. The driver sat in a narrow cockpit surrounded by a metal structure with minimal protection in the event of an accident. There were no seatbelts, no roll cages in the modern sense, no crumple zones, and no helmets meeting contemporary standards. Driving such a machine required not only skill, but also enormous courage. The Buick Bug was fast, but it was never easy or safe. One of the most unusual aspects of the Buick Bug was its cooling system. Instead of a conventional radiator mounted vertically at the front of the vehicle, engineers employed a system of tubes wrapped around the front section of the bodywork. Such an arrangement looked unusual, but it had a purpose. It allowed the enormous engine to be cooled, while also enabling the creation of a more rounded nose. At a time when aerodynamics was more intuition than science, solutions like this represented very bold experimentation. The Bug was wrapped in cooling elements like vanes, further enhancing its organic, insect-like character. Added to this were the open exhaust pipes protruding from the side of the hood. When the engine was running, they could shoot flames, making the car a spectacle in itself. The public loved such things. Racing in the early 20th century was not only a sport, but also a technological show, a display of courage and noise. Buick understood this perfectly. The Bug was intended to amaze, intimidate, and attract crowds. When it appeared on a track, it looked like a car from another world. That is precisely why, despite its lack of major victories, It remained in people's memories far more strongly than many more successful but less spectacular machines. The drivers of the Buick Bugs were among the most famous American racers of the period. Louis Chevrolet was a man whose surname would soon become one of the most important automotive brands in the world. Before Chevrolet existed as a manufacturer, however, Louis was a fearless and talented racing driver. The second great name was Bob Burman, known as Wild Bob. Burman was famous for his uncompromising driving style and an attitude perfectly summarized by the phrase often attributed to him: "Either the car holds together and I win at full throttle, or it breaks and I lose." Men like these were perfectly suited to the Buick Bug. The car required a driver who was not afraid of speed, instability, and risk. Burman named his machine Space Eater, but the public and the racing community preferred the name Bug. Chevrolet, meanwhile, suffered an accident during one of the first tests after a tire failure. According to reports, he survived partly because he ducked deeper into the cockpit, while the metal structural elements of the body provided minimal protection. The incident demonstrated just how dangerous the beginnings of professional automobile racing truly were. Tires, brakes, suspension systems, and body structures were still struggling to keep pace with increasingly powerful engines. The greatest weakness of the Buick Bug was its stability. The car was very narrow and had a small track width. On straight sections, this reduced air resistance and allowed impressive speeds to be achieved. The problem appeared in corners. On oval tracks such as Indianapolis, the Bug was extraordinarily difficult to control. Drivers had to fight the car's tendency to drift wide, lose stability, and even roll over. The machine was as fast as a projectile, but not necessarily effective in traffic among competitors. That is why its racing career was not as triumphant as its technical specifications and appearance might suggest. Buick wanted revenge at Indianapolis and wanted to show the world a revolutionary racing car, but in practice, the Bug proved too radical. It was excellent in short-distance speed trials and on straightaways, but on tracks requiring turning, its weaknesses became highly visible. This is the paradox of the design. In many ways, it was ahead of its time, yet it was also a product of an era of experimentation, when engineers often learned through trial and error. The Buick Bug was not perfect, but that is exactly what makes it so fascinating. It captures the moment when speed began to outpace control. Buick built only 2 examples of the Bug. One was intended for Louis Chevrolet, the other for Bob Burman. This number alone makes the automobile extraordinarily rare today. It was not a production model, nor even a small series intended for customers. It was a purely racing machine, created as a technical weapon and promotional tool. The fate of Chevrolet's example remains unclear, and the car most likely did not survive to the present day. The example associated with Bob Burman has survived and is currently housed in the Sloan Museum collection in Flint, Michigan. Its path to the museum, however, was rather turbulent. According to one story, the car was discovered years later in a barn in Kansas. It eventually came into the possession of Charles Howard, Buick's powerful distributor on the west coast of the United States, also known as the owner of the legendary racehorse Seabiscuit. Howard regarded the Bug as a valuable relic of early motoring and displayed it publicly for some time. The automobile later became associated with museum collections, and at one point there were even complications concerning its status and storage location. Today, however, the most important fact is that one Bug survived, has been preserved, and can still be displayed as one of the most valuable witnesses to the birth of American motorsport. The value of the Buick Bug is extremely difficult to determine because the car practically has no equivalent on the market. This is not a standard Buick from the early 20th century that can be compared with other surviving examples. It is one of only 2 racing cars built, and only one is known to exist. It has direct connections to Louis Chevrolet, Bob Burman, William Durant, early Indianapolis racing, and the history of the Buick brand. As early as the 1980s, estimates valued it at several $100,000, which adjusted for modern purchasing power would represent figures well above $1 million. However, the modern market for historic racing cars is completely different today. Unique machines with documented histories can achieve multi-million-dollar prices. If the Buick Bug were offered at a prestigious auction today, its value could easily exceed several $1,000,000. With the right narrative, complete documentation, and interest from American collectors, the price could climb even higher. In practice, however, the car should be regarded as a priceless museum exhibit. Its historical significance is greater than its financial value. It is a vehicle that tells the story of the birth of America's culture of speed. The Buick Bug is also an icon of motoring because it combines several important breakthroughs. First, it was one of the first American racing cars so heavily devoted to aerodynamics and the reduction of air resistance. Second, it employed a central driving position and a single-seat body at a time when racing was still dominated by layouts that included a riding mechanic. Third, it promoted Buick's overhead valve engine, a technology that later became one of the foundations of modern internal combustion engines. Fourth, it symbolized the courage of American designers who were not afraid to experiment with form and engineering. Finally, it was associated with people who helped shape automotive history. Louis Chevrolet, Bob Burman, and William Durant are names that by themselves give this machine enormous significance. The Bug did not win a major racing series and did not become the beginning of a production line of sporting Buicks, but its legend survived precisely because it was radical. It was like a flash on the boundary between two eras, the carriage-built past and the age of modern automobile racing. It should also be remembered that the Buick Bug was created at a moment when American motoring was only beginning to build its identity. Europe had its road races, its prestigious brands, and its technical traditions. America was searching for its own path. That path became large engines, oval tracks, speed records, spectacle, and mechanical directness. The Buick Bug fit perfectly into that world. It was not subtle or refined in the European sense. It was bold, loud, fast, and somewhat dangerous. It had a huge engine, flames from its exhaust, a narrow body, and a driver sitting alone in the center of the machine. It was the pure essence of early American racing. The Bug demonstrated that a racing car could be more than a modified road vehicle. It could be a separate construction created specifically for speed, publicity, and excitement. In that sense, it was a precursor to later Indianapolis racers and the entire culture of American motorsport. Its story reminds us that many great ideas are born, not as perfect products, but as wild experiments. Today, the surviving Buick Bug is one of the most important exhibits connected with the early history of Buick and General Motors. Whenever it appears in public, it still attracts attention because it looks completely different from almost everything else produced in the early 20th century. Its red bodywork, aluminum wheel covers, cooling tubes, and enormous engine create the image of a car that is difficult to confuse with anything else. When its power plant is started, it becomes easy to understand why the public more than a century ago was fascinated by racing. This is not a quiet artifact meant to be observed behind glass. It is a machine that speaks best through sound, the smell of fuel, the movement of its mechanisms, and the fire from its exhaust. A modern observer may see it as a primitive construction, but beneath that simplicity lies a tremendous leap forward. The Buick Bug was one of the earliest examples of thinking about a car as an aerodynamic projectile driven by a single individual. It was an idea that would later dominate the entire world of racing. So why is the Buick Bug of 1909 and 1910 an icon of motoring? Because it was a car built at a moment when everything was still possible. There were no established formulas, and engineers and drivers were only beginning to discover what a true racing car should look like. The Buick Bug was a bold, imperfect, and fascinating answer. It had a gigantic engine, a streamlined body, a central driving position, and performance that pushed the limits of imagination. Only 2 examples were built, and one survived as a priceless witness to the age of pioneers. It was dangerous, difficult to drive, and far from perfect. But that is exactly why it captures the spirit of early motorsport so well. It was not a car of reason. It was a car of ambition. The Buick Bug demonstrated that speed could become a spectacle, technology could become advertising, and a car could become a legend even without great victories. It is one of those machines that did not have to win everything in order to enter history. And that is precisely why the Buick Bug is still regarded today as one of the most extraordinary and daring creations in the history of American motoring.